Man, if there's one thing I've learned during my short stay on this green earth, it's that nobody hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. Sure, you'll run into the occasional cool guy that was never interested in the brand, which is all fine and well, but holy dodongos, when it all comes down to it, the biggest slingers of overcooked critiques and insults come from the inside. It doesn't matter if it's in relation to the films, games, or books. Star Wars fans are some of the whiniest nerds you can find. And I happen to be one of them. But before I carry on, I'm just gonna let it be known that I have absolutely nothing to say about the recently released Star Wars films. It's a waste of time and a petty thing to argue about. Mostly because I don't have that strong of a connection with them. Now, the original trilogy and prequels, on the other hand, those are more of my forte. Now, whether or not you hate the prequels, you have to admit, nothing got the fans kicking and screaming harder than they did. Well, except for the new films. Most of the blame goes to The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, as both of these films offer less than amazing experiences. I personally am more inclined to say that's more of an issue with the latter, but it doesn't have a console game. Just Game Boy Advance. It was that boring of a movie. So without further ado, I'm just gonna hop into it. This is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, but not the film, no. Instead, the PlayStation 1 masterpiece. Developed by Big 8 Productions for both PC and PS1 in 1999, this game is a bit of an oddity, and I don't mean in the sense that it's hard to come by or obscure, but more because it's just so strange. For one, Big 8 Productions doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which is already a red flag. A quick Google search proved effective, however, and shows that they worked on these absolute classics. Man, what a long list! Something else is that the game itself came out a month before the film. The PC version, at least. Have you ever seen those news interviews of people who had just seen the film and they're like half amazed, half disappointed? Imagine playing this first. That would easily be the worst way to experience the story. Now, hear me out. I'm usually not one to nitpick the tiniest of things, but would someone mind telling me just what the hell is going on here? Alright, so we got Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, which was obvious enough, and they're just standing there. So why is there so much motion blur? Is this supposed to be what it looks like when a Jedi uses force speed but doesn't move? And there's even a music video, that of which is set to Duel of the Fates and plays among various clips from the film as well as John Williams conducting. Pay attention to this, because I'm gonna come back to it later.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Now, your first impression will probably be that the game looks pretty subpar for the PS1, and while it's definitely no Resident Evil 2, it's at least serviceable. Strangely enough, the PC version is just about as unappealing. You know, it's pretty funny that in an age where the PC platform is considered to be the best looking, which I'd have to agree, it wasn't always that way. Some of those games used to look like this. If I really had to explain what this game looks like, I'd probably say it's close to Metal Gear running at half settings. No, not Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear. But hey, it was 1999 and video game graphics were still considerably primitive, if you completely ignore Spyro 2, Ocarina of Time, and pretty much every game in the Japanese Dreamcast library. So with that out of the way, here's the down low. The game follows the events of the titular movie it's based on and sees you running around various planets, killing enemies, and solving quote-unquote puzzles. It really is nothing to write home about, which actually pains me to say. This is a game I absolutely loved as a kid, even though I hardly knew what I was doing half the time. Remember, this was during an age before Star Wars Battlefront was a thing. Like I was saying, the game closely follows the events of the movie, meaning you're gonna be spending a lot of time gallivanting around as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Qui-Gon Jinn, and a few others, but more on them later. But hey, you get to be a Jedi, so that means it's gonna be pretty cool, right? No. No, it doesn't. Despite being incredibly acrobatic and well-versed in the arts of combat as well as the Force, this makes me never want to become a Jedi. Let's start with the basic things first. The game utilizes tank controls. Not exactly the ideal scheme for a Star Wars title, but that's just the beginning of it. Coupled with clunky maneuverability is copious amounts of platforming, something that should really make you begin to understand what the problem here is. See, with the exception of something like Croc, most games that make use of tank controls are usually slower-paced, atmosphere-driven games. Dino Crisis, Silent Hill, even Alone in the Dark, games that make use of panic by limiting control in the hands of the player. Big Ape must have been doped out, because never have I ever thought that a combat-focused Star Wars game where you take part in platforming would be a good fit for tank controls. And if you're wondering, yes, the combat suffers as well. Your main means of fighting is of course a lightsaber and even a force push. The lightsaber does well enough in its own right, most enemies die after a few hits, and believe me when I say it's not as clunky as it looks. Deflecting shots, on the other hand, that's an entirely different story. But before I begin complaining, credit where credit is due. I'm pretty sure this is one of the first games where you can do this. And it really shows. So what do? You hold down the square button and wait for enemies to begin shooting at you, but not only that, you also have to maneuver the lightsaber in an effort to aim the ricochet. Interestingly enough, you can actually pick up other weapons to use. I'm talking blaster rifles, missile launchers, and even thermal detonators. Holy shit, everyone like it! These only add to the mediocrity of the game, as it goes from being a third-person action platformer game with tank controls to a third-person action platformer, third-person shooter game with tank controls. If you can't tell by now, the weapons kind of suck, and you'll only ever use them when you remember that they're in your inventory. And it's made all the more laughable when you remember exactly who you're playing as: a Jedi. That being said though, you're not always running around as just Kenobi or Jin. The game actually changes it up a few times, meaning you get to play as Padme and Panaka. I don't want to play as either of these two. Whatever fun factor there is in regards to waving around the lightsaber like an idiot in an effort to kill droids is stripped away, as you're limited only to blasters and projectiles. I get that a few liberties had to be taken, seriously, nobody wants to watch Anakin go through the Jedi trials, but did the focus really have to change to Panaka running around Coruscant protecting Amidala? Aside from all of that, the game is pretty vanilla. When you're not running around platforming, you're awkwardly partaking in battle. However, there is one more aspect of gameplay that requires mentioning, and that is the dialogue options. Surprisingly enough, there's a lot of talking in this game, whether it's by means of bartering or simply progressing the story. It's nothing too advanced, but seeing this type of system utilized in a PS1 game is pretty interesting. Hell, it's practically a time capsule in its own right, seeing how advanced and in-depth speaking mechanics would go in future Star Wars games. There's even a whole level dedicated to its inclusion, as you have to run around Tatooine and bargain with people for various pieces of technology. By far, the most impressive thing here that, in my opinion, makes the game worth playing is that you can kill just about any NPC you want. It doesn't matter how vital they are to the game's progression, if you see them, you can murder them. Granted, this impedes any and all progress on your part, but it's still incredibly entertaining killing characters like Jar Jar just because you can. Take this for example. During the Theed mission, you come across a kid that just wants to reunite with his mom. So, like any sensible person, I killed him! Yes, you can even kill children in this game. Something not possible in modern Fallout games because it's too dark. And it doesn't even end there, because you can straight up kill Shmi Skywalker in front of Anakin. And he does this in retaliation.
This game has balls.
But what it doesn't have is good voice acting. I mean, people like to critique the acting within the films, and no matter what opinions you may have, you can't deny that the performances here are about 10 times worse. It's really not every day that you hear such wooden voice acting in a video game, though there are definitely some exceptions to the rule, but man, even back in 1999 with games like Metal Gear Solid, this is as stiff as a board. Surprisingly enough, the biggest perpetrator isn't Anakin, who is in fact voiced by Jake Lloyd, but instead Obi-Wan and...
You're stepping on my dress.
I suppose it's perfectly complemented by the god-awful camera placement. What the hell is it doing in such a position? It's like a weird half and half stuck between overhead and traditional third-person point of view. It isn't helped by the game's already difficult platforming moments, which, when mixed with the clunky tank controls and whatever type of camera angle this is, makes for some of the most frustrating jumping challenges ever. Easily the most botched thing is the depth perception. Certain platforms appear closer than they actually are, resulting in Obi-Wan spiraling to his death too many times to count. I really don't even even know how to convey my frustration regarding such an idiotic design choice. Who in their right mind thought this was a good idea? It's seriously almost as bad as platforming in a first-person game. The style does not complement the mechanic and makes for a jarring experience. In fact, the only other game I can think of that combines platforming with such a horrible type of camera is Bubsy 3D. That is not a comparison that should ever be drawn, and I legitimately feel bad for this game. Though, if there is one thing it does well, it's following the narrative of the film. Granted, there are moments where it deviates from the source material, like Qui-Gon having to deal with gangsters in Tatooine, and Panaka having to babysit the Queen. Aside from that though, it's one of those movie licensed games that stays true to the source material. I always hated film-based games that broke away from what they were based on. Amazing Spider-Man 2 was one of those guilty titles, though breaking away from the movie is the least of that game's worries. Something really strange is that while the game makes use of FMV cutscenes, they're done with good old PS1 CGI. Remember that music video from earlier? Really makes you wonder why they didn't just use certain scenes from the movie. Sure, they'd be incredibly bit crushed, but anything looks better than this. So, in an effort to avoid redundancy, this is the final battle with Darth Maul, admittedly the best part of the game. Unfortunately, it doesn't last long, as it's broken into sequences that are interrupted by Padme leading the assault on the Viceroy. There's also a lot of platforming here. It sucks. You do eventually get to duke it out with Maul, but despite how awesome this should be, it's less like two seasoned users of the Force duking it out, and more like two 5-year-olds in a swimming pool whacking each other with the water noodles. The fact that I could just shoot Maul in the face with a rocket launcher at any moment is pretty humorous though. Also, when did he ever use Force Lightning? Even after this, I'm pretty sure it was one of those things that he just never did. And just like that, the coolest Star Wars character dies. On a platform above the reactor shaft. Just like the movie. Just how Georgie wanted it. And that was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the movie, the game. And rightfully so, it's a forgettable, frustrating experience. On top of the eye-gouging graphics, botched controls, and laughable voice acting, it's easily one of the weakest Star Wars games out there. Seriously, compare it to something like KOTOR or The Force Unleashed. It's PS1 shovelware is what it is. Admittedly, there was a lot of good stuff to come from The Phantom Menace and prequels as a whole. Star Wars Battlefront is easily the most identifiable of these, but don't forget Star Wars Episode 1 Racer or Star Wars Bounty Hunter. When it comes to Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the movie, the game, and the rest of those bomb-bad experiences, I have a bad feeling.